Welcome back to another deep dive from the Rooster Pod log. You know, I always love to tackle the big questions, and today is no exception. Can our names really influence our destinies? I mean, it sounds a little bit out there, but there's some really interesting research on the topic. We even have a story about two families with wildly different approaches to naming their kids. You'll have to wait and see how that turns out.
Well, this idea actually touches on something called nominative determinism.
Nominative determinism, huh?
Yeah. It's this theory that suggests our names can subtly, maybe subconsciously even, nudge us towards certain choices in life, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but without any sort of mystical force at play.
So it's more about how our names interact with our sense of self and the choices we make.
Exactly. It's a fascinating connection between names, identity, and those decisions we make along the way.
Okay, so nominative determinism it is. But break that down for me and for our listeners. It does sound a little bit like something out of a prophecy.
Okay, sure. Imagine you're looking for, I don't know, a dentist, and you're looking through a directory, one of those old school phone books. Maybe they don't even have those anymore.
Oh, they do. I actually saw one the other day.
Right, so you're flipping through looking for a dentist. Would you be even just a little bit more likely to stop at a name like Dennis than, let's say, David?
You know, I think I might. It's almost like my brain is making a connection without me even realizing it.
Exactly. And that's where implicit egotism comes in. It's like this unconscious tendency we have as humans to be drawn toward things that remind us of ourselves. And you know what? That includes our names.
So you're saying that our names might create these little unconscious biases that shape our decisions.
It's not so much that our names control our destinies, but they might play a role in influencing the decisions we make.
I can see that. Like a kid named Dennis, playing dentist with his toys. Somewhere deep down, that connection starts to form. Is that the sort of thing that the research suggests?
Actually, there was a study from the University of New Mexico that found people named Dennis were slightly more likely to become dentists than you'd expect. And another study showed a similar trend with people named George being more likely to live in Georgia.
Those are really interesting examples. But I have to ask, aren't those probably just coincidences? I mean, what about the bigger picture?
You're absolutely right. It's really important to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. I'm sure there are plenty of dentists out there who chose careers that have nothing to do with dentistry, and the influence of names today is probably much weaker than it was in the past. I mean, think about it. We have so many more opportunities and educational paths available to us now.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's probably less about some kind of predetermined destiny and more about how those early associations we have with our names help shape our sense of self.
Oh.
But I know our listeners are probably eager to hear about those families from our source material. This is where the whole nature versus nurture debate really comes into play.
Oh, I am definitely curious about that. It'll be interesting to see how these parents approached naming their kids and how those kids ultimately ended up forging their own paths, which is really the big question, isn't it? What are the factors that truly shape our lives?
So first up, we have the Johnsons. And they were big believers, you
Yeah.
can say, in the power of names. They named their son Victor because they hoped he'd achieve great things in life. And their daughter Grace, well, they thought she would embody, well, grace and elegance.
Sounds like they might have fallen into the trap of trying to preordain their children's destinies through their names. Of course, life rarely goes according to plan, does it?
That is so true. So Victor, even though he did pretty well for himself, he struggled with a lot of anxiety. He felt this huge weight of expectation, to live up to his name. It was almost like the name itself became a source of stress rather than inspiration.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because those expectations, even if they are well-intentioned, can actually backfire.
Totally. And get this, Grace actually found her passion in a field that seemed completely at odds with her name engineering.
Oh, wow.
It's like she rebelled against this path her parents had imagined for her. And the best part, she's thriving in this challenging technical field.
That's fascinating. These stories really highlight how nominative determinism, while it might exist, has its limits. It's not about forcing outcomes, but recognizing the possibility for subtle influence. And sometimes, like we saw with Grace, those influences can actually lead to a reaction in the completely opposite direction.
Okay, so now let's meet the Smiths. They took a completely different approach when it came to naming. They picked names they just liked, simple as that, Jack and Lily. Their focus was creating an environment where their kids could explore and follow their passions.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like they really focused on giving their kids the space to discover themselves rather than pushing them into certain roles. But I'm curious, did their names end up foreshadowing their futures at all?
I'm happy to report that Jack did not become a lumberjack. He's actually an entomologist now. He was fascinated by bugs as a kid, and now he works with them every day.
It sounds like he found his calling. The Smiths really understood the importance of nurturing individual passions and giving their kids space to figure things out for themselves. What about Lily?
Well, Lily loved to paint. She's actually a muralist now, creating beautiful art for everyone to enjoy. Both kids ended up with careers that match their interests, even though they have, pretty ordinary names. I think that's a really important lesson.
I completely agree. It reminds us that names are just the starting point. Life is about figuring out who we are, what we love, and how we can contribute to the world.
So what do you think, listener? Which parenting approach resonates more with you? And do these stories support or challenge your own beliefs about the power of names?
It's something worth thinking about. We've looked at those really interesting individual cases, and now I'd like to see what kind of broader trends we can find in the research. That might lead us to a conversation about cultural influences and societal expectations.
All right, let's dig deeper and see what the research tells us about the real impact of names on our lives. All right, so we've looked at some pretty interesting individuals' stories. We even talked about how different naming styles might play out within a family. But now I'm thinking about the bigger picture. Is there any research on societal trends or maybe how cultural influences play a role when it comes to names and destiny?
Well, there's this really fascinating study from the University of Pennsylvania. They analyzed decades of baby name data, and what they found was, as certain names became more popular, the career paths associated with those names didn't really change.
So even if a name like, I don't know, Hunter becomes super trendy, it doesn't mean there's going to be this huge increase in hunters becoming park rangers or wilderness guides.
Exactly. The researchers basically concluded that even if our names create some initial biases or expectations, those expectations are often outweighed by other factors, things like socioeconomic background, educational opportunities, and cultural norms. Those things probably have a much bigger impact. That makes me wonder about how names are viewed in different cultures. I mean, in some cultures, names are chosen based on their meaning or because of family history. And in other cultures, it's more about how the name sounds or just personal preference.
That's a great point. And it makes things even more complicated. There's a whole field of study called onomastics. It's basically the study of names. And researchers in this field have found that naming practices are so diverse, they're deeply connected to each culture's values and beliefs.
So while it's fun to think about those unusual cases of nominative determinism, we have to remember that the relationship between names and destiny isn't that simple.
You got it. And it's really important to remember that even if our names do have a subtle influence on us, they don't control our lives. We still have the ability to make our own choices. And we can carve our own destinies, no matter what name we were given.
I think that's a really great message for our listeners. It's not about letting our names define us, but about realizing that we can choose the paths that we want.
I totally agree. We all have our own unique talents and passions. And speaking of passions, I know a lot of parents really stress out about picking the perfect name for their child. They worry about limiting their child's potential or, setting them on the wrong path. What advice would you give to those parents?
I would say pick a name you love, a name that has meaning for you and your family. But even more importantly, focus on creating a home where your child feels loved and supported. Make it a place where they feel safe to try new things, even make mistakes, and discover what they are passionate about.
So it's not about finding a magical name that guarantees success. It's more about creating a positive environment where children can thrive.
Absolutely. It's about celebrating each child's individuality and giving them the tools they need to achieve their dreams. At the end of the day, a name is just a name. The values we teach, the experiences we provide, and the love we share, those are the things that really shape a child's life.
I really like that perspective. It takes the pressure off finding this perfect name and reminds us what's really important, raising happy and healthy children.
Exactly. And it reminds us that being a parent is an ongoing process. It's about supporting and encouraging our children to become the best versions of themselves, no matter what their name is.
That is beautifully said.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the whole debate about names and destiny.
It's definitely a fascinating topic, and I think it makes us wonder about all sorts of things. Our identities, the choices we make, and how we fit into the world around us. But in the end, I don't think our destinies are decided by our names. Our destinies are created by our actions, the values we live by, and the relationships we build throughout our lives.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's a reminder that we have the power to write our own stories. We can choose to defy expectations and embrace whatever life throws our way. We've explored the research and heard some interesting stories. We even touched on how cultural influences play a role. But now I want to shift gears and bring it back to you, the listener. This whole deep dive has really got me thinking. If you could go back and rename yourself, would you?
That's a really interesting question to think about. It's almost like a thought experiment, you know? It makes you think about your identity. Would you want a name with a different meaning? Or a name that better reflects who you are now? Or would you stick with the name you have and all the memories that go with it?
I know I've already thought of a few different names for myself, but what's even more interesting is the why behind it all. What would make you want to change your name, listener? What parts of yourself would you want that new name to represent?
I think that's the most important part. It's not about the specific name itself, it's more about the reasons behind wanting to change it. Thinking about this can make you realize how your name has impacted your life and how you've become the person you are today.
That's a really powerful realization. It's like, sure, our names might give us a certain starting point, but it's really our choices, our values, and our relationships that shape our paths.
I couldn't agree more. Our names might be on our birth certificates, but we are the ones writing our own stories.
I love that. Our destinies aren't set in stone.
Yeah,
We are constantly changing and growing throughout our lives.
exactly.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Thank you so much for joining us as we explored names, destinies, and the power of discovering who we are.
We hope this conversation has given you some new things to think about, and maybe even inspired you to think about your own journey. Remember, you're not defined by your name. You define you.
And there's always more to learn and explore, so keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.